Hello everyone. We'll start very shortly. Once everyone joins in, we'll aim by starting by 6:03. So I think we have quite a few people now, and let's just start with the webinar. Before I start, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Aditya. I work as a marketing specialist here at BenQ Australia. And today we have with us a very special BenQ ambassador, Joshua. Uh, as you all know, Joshua requires very little introduction. He is a nature and a wildlife photographer specializing in ice photography and photography. So Joshua today will be sharing snippets of his previous trip to up in the Arctics, and he will also talk about importance of color calibration and accuracy, post-production of ice and snow photography, and the full workflow that is involved. Also, we'll be talking about how to get the very best out of your raw files. I will hand over now to Joshua, and we'll start the webinar.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you happen to be in the world at this point in time. Thank you very much to BenQ for the opportunity to do this webinar today. This is something I really, really love to do. I don't get to do as many of them as I'd like due to my travel schedule, but when I do get an opportunity, I really like to do them. Now, I've only got an hour, so I'm not going to talk around this too much. I just want to get straight into it. So I'm going to just share my screen, and hopefully you can all now see a picture of a polar bear on your screen. And if somebody just
You can.
lets me know that they can see it, that would be fantastic. Okay. Now I can't actually see my chat window anymore as a result of this while I'm showing my screen. So if there's something that comes up, just let me know, and I'll do my best to sort of deal with it as we go along.
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. So what I want to do is I want to do a bit of a deep dive on Lightroom and just take you through my workflow and how to get the most out of your raw files when you come back from the field. Now, I guess the very first thing to say about this is, let me just move my video out of the way here so I can actually control what I'm doing. One of the very first things to say about this image of a polar bear, this was a raw file. It was captured up in Svalbard. It's of a fairly youngish male polar bear on the sea ice in winter. And the first thing to say about this image, let's just take it over to the develop module, actually, first of all. Okay, is if we go up here to the right-hand corner and we look at the histogram, what you can see is, okay, it was shot at a 600 millimeter at ISO 800, f7.1 at an 800th of a second. That's all good information to know. But what's really important to note here is that the histogram is biased towards the right-hand side. Now, those of you who've been on trips with me before or have heard me lecture before or talk about this may already be familiar with this concept of exposing to the right. Now, what you're doing when you're exposing to the right like this without clipping the highlights is effectively giving yourself a much better signal to noise ratio. So as you expose the histogram more towards the right-hand side, towards the highlights, you're going to get a much, much better signal to noise ratio than if you expose very poorly and underexpose the image. So I always try and expose my images to the right without clipping. And that way I've got the very, very best signal to noise ratio when I'm working on the image in Lightroom or in Photoshop or whatever software I might be using at the time. Now, just before I get too far ahead of myself, a little bit of information about what I'm working on here in my studio. So I'm working on the brand new BenQ SW272U monitor. This is a 4K Adobe RGB monitor. It's a very high-end photographic monitor, phenomenal performance in terms of color accuracy and luminosity as well. I've got it calibrated here in my studio to 6500 degrees Kelvin with a gamma of 2.2. I don't want to get too technical on why those are the right settings for my room. They are. 6500 degrees Kelvin is about right for most rooms with a luminance value of about 100 candelas. So this is my primary photographic monitor that I use for editing. The reason I use it is primarily because it is so good with color. Once it's calibrated, I know that the color that I'm looking at on the screen is the correct color for the polar bear in this case. So let's get into processing it, and we'll talk a little bit more about the pipeline here in Lightroom. There is a new feature here in the latest edition of Lightroom called HDR. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate that today, but I do want to talk about what it is very, very quickly, because it's caused quite a lot of confusion in the marketplace. And what it is it's not the stacking of images in what we would call the traditional HDR image or high dynamic range. What it is the ability to extend the dynamic range of your raw file to take advantage of displays such as Apple's XDR displays or any other display that is HDR capable, so that you can have brighter highlights. Now, the issue with using this is that it might be fine if you're looking at it on your monitor at home, but when you put it out to the web, on a website or on Facebook or on social media or something like that, nobody else can see it. So whilst it's an interesting piece of advancement from Adobe, it doesn't actually have that much, doesn't serve that much purpose or use at the moment. So personally, I'm ignoring it. I'm not using this new HDR feature at all. What we're going to do, though, is get into the develop module now and actually do a bit of work. I'm going to show you my workflow and just talk about the sliders and what they're doing under the hoods. Now, the first thing I want to do with this image, because it has been exposed a little bit to the right, is I just want to correct that. So I'm just going to slightly bring the exposure down a little bit. Now, you're just going to have to believe me that this is about right, or it is right on my calibrated display here. What you're seeing through Zoom may or may not be correct, but it's definitely right this. So I'm just going to adjust my exposure down a little bit. And what happens when I do that is, because I exposed it to the right-hand side, I've given myself that very high signal to noise ratio. So the best possible quality I can get out of that file. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my black point and my white point. What are my black points and white points? Those are the thing that's going to be the darkest in the image, the blackest point, and the point that's going to be the whitest point. So if we look at this image of the polar bear on screen, the darkest part of this image is probably going to be the bear's nose. And then the brightest part is probably going to be somewhere in the snow somewhere. But we need to set those correctly. The way to do that is if you hold down the Option key on a Mac, I think it's Alt on a PC, and you drag that slider down, you'll actually see, as the clipping starts to occur, what is going to be solid black. So I will bring that back up now. I don't know whether you can see that. Hopefully you can see that through Zoom. Until I've just got a tiny little bit of clipping of solid black right in the very depths of the bear's nostril. That's what I want to be the darkest point of my photograph. And then I'll do exactly the same for the whites. I'll hold down the Option key and just bring up the whites until I just start to get some clipping, and then back it off again until I have no clipping. And now I've set my black point and my white point correctly. And by doing that, I've increased the apparent contrast in the image very, very significantly. It was much flatter before I did that. So that gives me my two anchor points. Now, you can actually see those clipping indicators. If you come up here to the histogram and you turn them on, these clipping indicators up here, the shortcut key for that is J. You can turn that on and off just with the J key. And that's a very quick way to see, okay, I can see a tiny bit of clipping inside the bear's nose. That's okay. I want that to be actually solid black. Once I've done that, I can then just tweak it to taste with my shadows and highlight sliders. So I'm going to bring up my shadows a little bit just to bring up a bit more detail in that face. And I'll bring down my highlights quite significantly. And the reason I'm going to do that is I want to get texture and tone into my snow and ice. And again, those of you who've traveled with me or have heard me talk or lecture before on post-production with snow and ice, the most important thing is to have texture and tone. If you don't have texture and tone, what you end up with is big flat white areas that have no detail in them, and it doesn't look like snow. It just looks like a flat white area. So texture and tone are extremely important when you're working in images with snow and ice. So that's my goal. That's what I'm trying to achieve as I'm sort of fiddling with the dials up here. So that's about all I want to do up here in this first section. What I do want to do though is to set a white point. But just before I do, I neglected to mention this, but it's an important point. All of Adobe Lightroom's adjustments are what's called parametric, which means that they are non-destructive. So as you move the sliders around, what's happening under the hood is that Lightroom is creating a list of instructions for how the photograph's actually supposed to look. It's not actually mangling the pixels. And that's very important because it's non-destructive editing. And with non-destructive editing, we can do all sorts of things. And if we get into trouble, we can just reset the image and we've done no damage. So you never have to worry about ruining an image when you're working on it in Lightroom or in Camera Raw for that matter. The two are identical in terms of view of their processing pipeline. And if you do get into trouble, there's a reset button down the bottom, so you can just come down and hit reset. But let's set a white point. Now, the white point is going to determine how warm or how cool this photograph is. And when we look at the image, in fact, when we look at any photograph, it's very important to have a vision. So you need to have a creative vision in your mind about what it is that you want to say about the photograph. What is that you want to bring out? What's the statement that I want to make about this particular image? Now, obviously, this is a lovely moment. The bear's coming straight towards me. I'm at eye level with the animal, but we've got some really nice, cool snow and ice down the bottom and quite a nice warm sky. And I think we can probably do a bit of work with this. So we'll just, at the moment, this was auto white balance. So as shot by the camera, and the camera made a decision at that point in time what the white balance should be. But as I shot this raw, I can change it later on. It's a free lunch if you like. There's no cost to changing it. So we have a number of options in the drop down. We have auto, daylight, cloudy, shade, etc. We might just see what auto does. And auto did warm it up fairly significantly, a little bit too much for my taste. So I'm just going to back that off. It is important to remember that we are seasoning to taste here with white balance. The most important thing, really, I think, with white balance is not whether you go too warm or too cool in your post-production, but whether you have too much cyan or magenta tint. Because if you do, and this is one of the big sins, if you like, that I see a lot, particularly when I'm judging photographic competitions, images that have a very, very strong magenta cast or a very strong cyan cast. So one of the ways that you can ensure that you don't have any sort of cyan or magenta color cast is if you click on the eyedropper, or the shortcut key is W, and you click on an area, you roll it over the image, it will actually show you what the RGB readout numbers are for that particular point of the image. So in this spot now, it's telling me that, okay, I've got red 96, green 97, and blue 98. So it's just ever so slightly blue, but those numbers are very, very close together. So if I click there, that's going to give me effectively a very neutral image. So it's going to make that particular part of the sky neutral, which means I'm going to have very, very neutral snow. Now, I still feel, to my eye personally, that that's a little warm, but I know now that the tint is set correctly. So I don't have too much cyan, too much magenta. So I'm going to just drag that back down to make it, just cool it off a little bit, because I want to have that dichotomy there of the cool snow and the warmer sky. We'll come to how we warm up the sky in a minute. So let's do that now. The next tab is the Presence tab now, which is texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. But the important thing to note about all of these adjustments is that they are global, meaning that if any change I make to these sliders is going to affect the entire photograph. And at this point in time, I really want to start making local adjustments. So I want to affect just the polar bear, or I want to affect just the sky. And one of the things that Adobe has done in the last update to Lightroom, which is the version I'm currently running, is give us incredibly powerful masking tools. So that is the ability to make local adjustments very, very easily, much, much easier than we ever could before. It's really been a game changer in terms of how we do post-production. So if I come up to this little circle here and I click that, that's my entrance to the masking tools. And I can add a new mask for the subject, for the sky, for the background. We'll just start with the subject, and I'll just click on the subject, and you can see straight away the algorithm has picked up the polar bear and it's done a really good job. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect, but it's done a very, very good job. Good enough for the sake of what we're going to do today, and certainly good enough for the post-production of finishing this image if I was to take it to print. I've selected the polar bear. What I'm going to do is, because it has all that beautiful, soft, fine fur, I want to add a little bit of texture into that. Not a lot, just sort of 10 to 12 points, which is just going to help give that bear's fur a more three-dimensional look and help bring it to life. And that's really one of the key things, I think, when you're working with any wildlife, is to try and keep it looking very natural, but to try and bring the animal to life, because we're working in a two-dimensional medium, not a three-dimensional medium. So we need to give the illusion of movement, we need to give the illusion of life, and it's quite hard to do. So it takes some practice. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a local sharpness adjustment. This is going to be, again, it's only going to be affecting that mask area, which is that red area there. You can turn that on and off with the O key, the shortcut O key, if you want to see what the area is you've selected. So I'm just going to add a little bit of sharpness. Again, that's just going to help to isolate and crisp up that bear. And that is effectively all I want to do with my mask on the bear at the moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a new mask, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to deal with warming up that sky a little bit. I'm going to use a gradient mask. The shortcut key for the gradient mask is M. And I'm going to drag that down, and you can see as I drag it down the area that's being selected, I want to have a fairly soft feathered edge there, because that transition I have in this image between the soft snow and ice and the foreground and the sky is naturally soft. And I want to keep that. I want to keep it going from a very soft blue into the yellow. And blue and yellow are complementary colors. They work very, very well together. So I don't want to create a hard horizon line here. But clearly I'm also affecting the bear at the moment, which I don't want. So I'm going to come up to my masking tools, and I'm just going to subtract and select subject. And that's going to take the bear out of the equation. So now we're not affecting the bear. You can see the area that we are affecting here in red. And then what we'll do is I will come up and I will use some color temperature just in the sky and just warm that sky back up a bit, just to bring back some of that yellow. Again, I hope you can see that through the Zoom on the webinar. You may not be able to, but you'll just have to trust me that I have warmed up that sky quite a bit and brought back quite a bit of yellow to it. Now I could, if I wanted to, also darken that sky off a little bit. I might just darken it off just a fraction. Again, I'm just making very, very small adjustments here to tweak the image. In my experience, if it's a great photograph, it doesn't need a lot of heavy-handed work with the sliders. It's already usually a pretty good photograph. It's just about tweaking it to taste and to bring out the best in the file. So that's about all I'm going to do to the sky in this instance. Again, there's not much going on up there. It's just that nice warm sky. If I wanted to send that sky color a little more towards the oranges, I could do that with the hue adjustment tool. I wouldn't use tint. I wouldn't push it into magenta here, because it's going to give it a very ugly tinge. It would be better to do it with the hue slider and push it more towards orange. But I like the yellow. I think it's very complementary with the bear. And I think that's where, as I said, it's very important to have a vision about what it is that you want to try and achieve with the photograph as you're working on the image. Another nice little tip that you can apply when you're working with wildlife and doing masks is you can do a local mask. I'm going to use the K shortcut key for that. And I'm just going to paint over the bear's eyes a little bit. I'm just going to turn off auto mask. Auto mask will try and look for edges to keep the area constrained. In this instance, I just don't want to be that accurate. I just want that general area around the eyes. And I'm just going to brighten that up again, just a fraction, just about a third of a stop. And what that's going to do is it helps the viewer's eye connect with the animal in the frame. And anytime you can do that, you're going to start to create more of an emotional attachment or an emotional connection to the image. So it's a nice little tip with wildlife to brighten up the eyes a little bit and help to draw the viewer into the animal. We can turn that off again with the K key. So we now have a total of 3 local adjustments we've made. We have the one on the bear, the one on the bear's eyes, and the one on the sky. Now, then we have to think about, okay, the snow and ice in the foreground. What do I want to do with the snow and ice in the foreground? Actually, just before I do that, I might do one more. There's one more new thing I want to show you that just came out in the latest edition of Lightroom, and it's called point color. And this is something I was asking for some time. And what it was is the ability to make individual HSL adjustments, so hue, saturation, and luminance adjustments inside a given mask. So for example, if we select our mask here of the sky, and we want to make a color adjustment just to the sky, we can select the point color here, take it over, and saying that color is still too neutral. So I'll just warm that up again a bit more, send that more yellow. It's still saying, there we go. So if I select that area there, I can click it and it shows me over here where that is in the color spectrum. And then I can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance. So I can darken that area off a lot. I'm just going to overdo this effect to demonstrate it. I can increase the saturation of that color significantly, or I could change the hue of that color very significantly as well. So you have incredible power inside a given mask now to make adjustments on a color basis using HSL, which is extremely powerful. So let's now look at our snow and ice in the foreground. And I think the way we'll do that is also with a gradient tool. But I'm going to drag it up from the bottom this time. And again, we'll subtract, come up here to our mask menu, and we'll subtract the subject so that we're not affecting the bear. You can see we're not affecting the bear now. We're just selecting the snow and ice in the foreground. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of contrast into that snow and ice. Again, there are some very nice soft lines and detail here in this snow and ice. It's not flat white. So I want to bring that out as best I can. So I'm going to add a little bit of contrast in there like that. And I'll just pump highlights just a fraction. And that's just going to bring out those little ridges a little bit more in the snow and ice. And I'll then also just send it a little blue. Just cool that area off a little bit. So now I've got that really nice dichotomy going on between the soft blue bleeding into the warmer color in the sky, which I really like. And it's my vision for this photograph. Once I've done that, I'll just close off my masks. Now, there's no limit, I should say, no practical limit, rather, to how many of these masks you can actually have. I've never hit the limit, if there is one. You can do quite a lot of other things up here with the masks, such as renaming them. If you want to come back, if you end up with a whole bunch of them, and you want to come in and name them so you know what they are, for example, bear's eyes, you can do that. I typically don't bother in my own workflow. I can usually just go back and click on the mask and say, okay, I can see what that mask does. If I need to make an adjustment to it, I can. So let's move further down to the tone curve and just talk, excuse me, a little bit about what tone curve is. So back in the late unpleasantness many years ago, we didn't have a nice set of sliders like this, where we had exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Basically, we had a tone curve adjustment, which was how we added contrast to the image and how we adjusted our whites and blacks. Now, like all things Adobe, there's multiple ways to achieve the same thing. So the tone curve, in many ways, is, for lack of a better word, it's a bit of a relic. And if you have set your sliders correctly up here, in the develop tab up here, you really don't need to apply to fiddle with tone curve. You should have actually been able to get it all correct up here. If you need to make a tone curve adjustment, of course you can, but typically I'm finished with those sort of adjustments by the time I get down here into the tone curve area. Okay. I didn't talk about texture clarity and dehaze, but I will talk about them just briefly, because I think they're important to know about. As I said, these are global adjustments. If I use them now, they're going to affect the entire image. Clarity is very much a local contrast enhancement. So typically what it does is it makes an image look crunchier. So the more clarity you add, the crunchier it's going to get. So if I massively overdo clarity there, just for effect, you can see how awful it looks. It is just way overdone. So as you bring up clarity very significantly, it will actually start to obscure fine detail. So what's going on under the hood there, that it is similar to a high pass sharpen, with an ever expanding radius as you bring up the clarity slider. So you need to be very careful with the use of clarity. Typically, if I do use clarity to process one of my photographs, it's usually a very small amount, 10, 12 points, something like that. And the same applies for dehaze. The best use I've found for dehaze is when you have an image that has a lot of fog in it. So if I'd been photographing icebergs in fog and I wanted to try and make the iceberg stand out more from the fog, dehaze would be a very, very good way to do that. But you don't want to overdo the effect. You need to, like all these tools, I think a little bit goes a long way. If you overdo dehaze, it will start to look very unnatural. If you walk outside and you look in the distance, perhaps this is perhaps the best way to explain dehaze. You look into the distance. The distant mountains are always quite soft. And the reason for that is because that's the way the human eye works. It sees things at a very, very far distance as being quite soft. If you use too much dehaze, it will remove that softness. And the image starts to look very, very unnatural. So just be careful with dehaze and clarity. They are very, very useful, very powerful tools, and a little bit goes a long way with them. When it comes to vibrance and saturation, as I said, I like to make my adjustments locally rather than globally usually, so that I can affect just the part of the image that I want. But in this instance, I'm not going to use them because I've done my color corrections, I've done my adjustments for saturation already. Vibrance, however, will try and saturate the most desaturated colors in an image first. So it's most useful with portraiture, I find, where if you're photographing a person and they're wearing, let's say, a bright red jacket, and you bring up vibrance, it will probably bring up the red in the jacket, but not the color in their face or skin. So you need to, it is image specific, so you need to just fiddle with it a little bit. But typically, as I said, I don't use these tools globally. I prefer to do my adjustments locally. Then we come down to Color Mixer, where we have our ability to make HSL adjustments. This is very similar to point color, except that, again, it's global. So if I click this little button here, this little round circle, this is called the targeted adjustment tool. And if you click that, and if I roll it over, you can see it actually will highlight what color is in that part of the photograph. And then you can drag up, drag down to make adjustments to that particular area. If I massively overdo it, you'll be able to see it on the screen there. So it's a very nice way to target specific colors in an image if you need to. Now I want to talk about the detail slider. And I know I'm going at quite a pace here. It's because we don't have a lot of time. I only have an hour to do this. And I'm lecturing during a workshop. Sometimes I'll take up to 2.5 hours to go through processing a single image like this. Let's talk about sharpening. So the first thing to see about sharpening is that sharpening really comes in 3 stages. You have capture sharpening, creative sharpening, and what's called output sharpening. So what we're going to look at today is is the first step, or capture sharpening, which is really just restoring the inherent sharpness to the raw file, making it look good on screen, if you like, at 100%. And it is important that you do this at 100%. You cannot judge the sharpening at anything other than 100% on screen. So you actually do need to zoom in. Oops, sorry about that. Let's go back here, grab our polar bear again. Okay, back to develop. And just zoom in. You must be zoomed into 100% when you do this. It's the only way to accurately gauge the sharpening. And the reason for that is because if you're not, your monitor is having to scale the image and you can't accurately tell what's going on in terms of sharpening. Now we have 4 sliders. They are amount, radius, detail, and masking. The one I like to set first, and the one I would argue should be at the top, is actually the radius. Now, the radius determines how many pixels either side of an edge get lightened or darkened. And that's the way sharpening works in the digital domain. So the apparent acuteness, or the apparent sharpness of an image, is determined by the lightness of the light side and the darkness of the dark side of a given edge. So when you apply sharpening, you're lightening the light side and darkening the dark side of an edge to increase the apparent acuteness on the screen. That's how it actually works. Now, the radius determines how many pixels either side of that edge actually get lightened or darkened. So the default radius is 1 pixel. So 1 pixel either side of every edge is going to get lightened or darkened. Now, 1 is actually a very, very good default. And if you don't move it from 1, that's okay. But there is an optimum way to set this. If you hold down the Option or the Alt key, it will actually show you a gray screen, and you can actually see the difference as you move the radius. Now, I like to set an image that has a lot of high frequency detail. That is an image like this. We've got a lot of very, very fine detail in this bear's fur. That's what's called high frequency information. Or if we had an image of, say, a grass field with a lot of blades of grass, that's high frequency information. There's a lot of information in a very small space. If we had a photograph here, this area here, the sky, for example, is very low frequency, but the area we want to sharpen specifically is the bear. So in this case, I would use a low radius. And that's going to mean we're going to make sure we don't obscure any fine detail. So once I've set the radius on 0.8 in this example, now if it had been a portrait of a beautiful person, I would probably set a higher radius so that I was not sharpening all the individual pores in their skin, but rather applying a softer look. Once I've set the radius, I can hold down the Option or Alt key again, and it will actually show me the image in black and white. And the reason it does that is because sharpening is actually being applied to the luminance channel only, not to the color information in the image. So by showing the image in black and white, it just makes it a little bit easier to view and judge the sharpening. And then I'll just increase that to, let's say, 60 points. And if you're not sure what is the right amount, you can actually do a before and after, zoomed into 100%. The before and after shortcut key is Y. And I can see now, looking between the two, that the image on the right, the after, is that little bit sharper and crisper than the one on the left. So that means I've got the sharpening set correctly. However, he says, we have applied this sharpening globally to the entire image, and that's not what we wanted. I only really wanted to affect the polar bear, because that's what I want to be sharp in the photograph. So I'm going to just hold down the Option or the Alt key again if you're on a PC. And as I bring up the masking, anything that's showing as black will no longer get sharpening applied to it. So I'm just going to mask off some of that sky, probably somewhere around there. And that's why that's important is there are two reasons that's important, basically. One, we don't need to sharpen the sky. There's no detail there anyway. But more importantly, sharpening adds noise. So we want to make the image as noise-free as we possibly can. So it's a good idea to always just check the masking for a given image. Every image is different. And that's why presets in many ways are a waste of time and a bit of a waste of money, to be honest. There's a lot of presets for sale out there these days. They may get you to a decent starting point in some situations, but they're never as good as seasoning to taste for an individual photograph. So I don't use presets in my workflow other than noise presets, which I specifically developed for the EOS R3, which I shoot, and the EOS 1DX Mark III. But I prefer otherwise to do all my post-production on an individual image basis and get it as good as I can, tweak it as much as I can. Now, once we've done the sharpening, we have noise reduction. Now, it is very important to note at this point that sharpening and noise reduction are interactive. What that means is that as you increase the noise reduction in the photograph, if you are going to increase noise reduction, you must increase the sharpness as well, because noise reduction works by smoothing an image, making it look softer to smooth out the noise. So as a result of that, you need to apply additional sharpening. Now, there are two types of noise that we basically need to deal with. One is luminance noise and one is color noise. Now, back in the early days of digital, color noise was a lot more of a problem than it is nowadays. We really don't see much in the way of color noise anymore, except at ridiculously high 500,000 ISOs and things like that, where it may show up as cyan and magenta blotching in the image. Certainly, there's no color noise in this photograph, and it was shot at ISO 800 on the EOS R3, which basically means there's no noise, no luminance noise either. Now, if there was, that luminance noise would show up as what looks like film grain, and you can just tweak it with a luminance slider to bring it down. If you have a very noisy image, you can actually use Adobe's denoise, which is very, very powerful an AI noise reduction algorithm that will actually analyze the image, and then it will create a separate DNG file that has been denoised. Now, let's actually bring it up and do it, because it's quite processor intensive. But I just want to show, let me just drag this on here so you can see it. It shows you the preview of the image at 100% before and after. Now, my experience with this has been that typically an amount somewhere between 30 and 50 is about right for a noisy photograph. More than that, and the image can start to look quite plasticky and quite unnatural. So again, be very, very careful with noise reduction. A little bit goes a long way. A little bit of green is often far preferable to a plastic look. So in this case, I'm not going to apply any noise reduction. Just to give you some idea of how processor intensive this is, I think it says an estimated time of 1 minute. So we're not going to do that today. So we'll just cancel out of that. Okay, moving down our list a little bit more, we have some options to do some adjustments to the image with transform, so vertical, horizontal. I don't do those things typically. That's more for an architectural photographer. And then we have lens blur and effects, such as vignetting. So basically, all those adjustments that I've made to this image would typically take me less than probably a minute, 30 seconds to go through and make these adjustments. I haven't cropped this image yet, so perhaps we should just talk about crop. Now, the shortcut key for getting into crop is the R key. And once you're in crop, you have a number of options. You can go up to the tools menu, and you can actually change the crop overlay. So at the moment, I have it set to thirds, but you can change this to golden mean, to a whole bunch of other overlays, depending on what it is that you might like to work with in your photographs. There's no right or wrong. I generally use thirds, but sometimes I want to put something in the center, so I'll set it to center as well. When I am cropping, I like to crop in what's called lights out mode, which basically means that I'm only looking at the image. I'm not looking at the side panels or the gray background, because I find them distracting. And then to get into lights out mode, it's just the L key, so lights, twice. One will take it to 50% dim, and then the second hit will take it to 100%. And then I can just crop the image slightly based on the sort of look that I want. Now, typically, I would crop to the original frame. Not always, but in this instance, I will. We'll just crop. I don't want to take anything off the bottom. I just wanted to remove a little bit of that negative space on the right-hand side. The other thing to note is with wildlife, particularly when you are cropping and when you are framing in the field, you really want to have the wildlife looking into the frame. So this bear is looking almost directly ahead, but he's looking slightly into the frame. If he was looking slightly the other way, we would have an awful lot of negative space on that side of the bear, which would be very unbalancing and would not give the eye a very comfortable place to rest. At the moment, we're drawn into the bear, we take in the background surrounding the bear, and we come back and we rest very nicely on the bear, and we're okay with that empty space on the right because it's positive space. That's just something to keep in mind. I'm always, when I'm shooting in the field, whether it's a bird or whether it's a mammal or whatever it might be, I'm always trying to make sure the animal is looking into the frame. Once I've done those adjustments, I am what I would call baking the cake. So I've done like 95% of the hard work. Really now it's about tweaking the image that little bit more. And I would take the image over to Photoshop, and I would use something like a Nik plugin to make maybe some further adjustments to the snow and ice to bring out even more texture and tone in that image. There is something I just want to talk about while you're doing that. So Lightroom gives us, if we go to Photo Edit In, Lightroom gives us the option to edit in Adobe Photoshop, but you can also open it as a smart object in Photoshop. And that's well worth doing, because a smart object is going to, first of all, it's going to save you space rather than creating multiple layers in Photoshop. But importantly, if you're going into something like a Nik or Topaz or something like that to make additional adjustments, if you do it as a smart object, you can then go back into that plugin and tweak those sliders a little bit if you need to. Whereas if you don't do it as a smart object, you have to render out a new layer. And then if you want to make an adjustment to that layer, using the same tool that you're using in Nick, you would have to either delete the layer and redo it again. So smart objects are a fantastic way to save a little bit of time and space. They're well worth using. Let's just jump back to the grid view. Actually, before we do that, let's just do a quick before and after. So here is our original raw file as shot, straight out of camera, nothing done whatsoever on the left. And then on the right, we have our finished file. So if I zoom into 100%, you can see, hopefully you can see through the zoom, that it's quite a bit crisper, that we have beautiful fine detail in the fur of the bear. All that snow on the bear's nose has got beautiful texture in it. And we've got the bear really standing out against that blue and yellow, the blue-white snow coming up against that warm sky. So it works very, very well for me. We've got a few minutes, so I just want to jump back to my grid view, and I want to show you a very cool little hack that was sent to me a few days ago by a client of mine who was with me in Greenland last month, and we photographed this particular iceberg together. And this is the raw file, fully unprocessed as captured. Now you can see straight away, okay, it's exposed to the right-hand side, but if I turn the clipping indicators on, there's no clipping at all. But what's really interesting with this hack, what I want to show you while I've still got a few minutes, is let's just adjust the exposure for the fact that it was exposed to the right, get that more in line. And we'll just very quickly set a white point and a black point. What is going to be the darkest part of the image and what is going to be the brightest part of the image. And a white point. Again, I'm just holding down the Option key so I can see exactly when clipping starts to occur. Okay, and I'm just going to bring down my highlights a little bit. Now, this image at the moment looks way too blue to me, but we'll deal with that later. The most important thing at the moment I want to show you is a hack for masks. So if we go up here and we want to work on, let's say we want to work on the sky. So we select the sky and Lightroom runs its algorithm, and we can see that it's not perfect, right? It's picked up some of the iceberg here around the edges. It hasn't got it exactly right. Now, if we come up to our mask and we subtract sky again, so we selected the sky, we're now going to subtract the sky. Okay, what it's done is it's left a whole bunch of red areas here. You may not be able to see them through zoom. If I then invert that, come up here and invert that. Try to invert that. What it's done is it's actually done a much better job, still not perfect, but it's better, of cleaning up the edge around the iceberg. So it's counterintuitive, but it actually works in most instances to select the sky, then deselect the sky, invert it, and you actually will often get a better edge around the edge of something like an iceberg or a mountain or whatever it might be. Now, in this instance, it's not perfect. I would need to go in with the brush still and make an adjustment. But it's a very, very cool little hack. I've also, there was a YouTube link sent to me on this as well, so it's well worth having a look at if you're often using sky masks, because every time you have to go in with the brush, it's time consuming. And if you can save a little bit of time here and there, that helps a lot. So I think what we're going to do at this point in time is we're just about at questions. So I think what we'll do is we'll turn it over to questions and give you guys a chance to ask questions if you might have any. Now, I can't actually see my chat window, so
That's fine. I'll read them out. I
yeah,
have
that'd be
the
great.
question answers open. We don't have any as of now.
Okay, that's great. Then I can keep talking about other stuff.
We did get one by Chrissy,
Mhm.
but I think this was early on during the webinar,
That's okay.
especially when you were working with the polar bear.
Mhm.
Is this like doing luminosity masking in Photoshop? This was Chrissy's question.
Okay, I think that she was talking about luminosity mask in relation to when I was starting to use the masks here in Lightroom.
Yes.
Lightroom gives you that option actually. If we go to develop module with our bear, and we go up to our masks and we create a new mask, you actually have a drop down there And one of the options is luminance range. So it is actually exactly the same as creating a luminosity mask in Photoshop. So you can actually do that here in Lightroom now without having to go to Photoshop. You can also do it through color range. That's through selecting specific colors in the image as well. So it's extremely powerful now, these new masking tools, and that ability to make local adjustments parametrically, that means non-destructively, with luminance masks or color masks, has just been a game changer for, I think, all photographers, whether you're a commercial photographer or a nature photographer like myself. It's just incredibly powerful. In the old days, before these masks, we would have to go in with a brush or take the image to Photoshop, which was much more time consuming. Okay. What I'll do then is,
Yes.
if I was going to say, if there are more questions, you can just throw them at me.
Oh, absolutely.
Otherwise, I will just take another image and just talk about it and do some post work on it.
Absolutely.
So this is an image of a Pallas cat. This is a very rare cat that lives in Mongolia, parts of China, parts of Russia. It's a very, very small wild cat, beautiful cat. This is an image I made earlier this year. I think it was in January this year on this Pallas cat. And again, you can see from the histogram that the image has been exposed to the right. So it looks very, very bright on the screen and needs to be corrected. But that's the first thing I would do. Again, whenever I do this, if you need to do this as a batch import, on import, you can do that. So if you've got a whole bunch of images you've shot that were all exposed to the right-hand side to get a better signal to noise ratio, when you're importing them, you can very, very easily apply a preset to fix it to multiple images. So you don't have to do it on an individual image basis, if you like. In this case, I am doing it individually because we're doing single images. So I'm just going to correct that and just bring that down again. Now, we will fix the fact that the snow went gray. And what's more important is that we get the right overall exposure first. And that's always the first step. So if you bring an image into Lightroom and it's too dark or it's too light, before you start to do highlights, blacks, shadows, things like that, you really need to get the exposure right. And I usually base that on the primary subject in the frame and what looks good to my eye. So I've taken it down 0.6 of a stop, so nearly a full stop. And then I'm going to set my black point and white point the same way. So just dragging down the blacks and hopefully then I'm going to see that clipping that's occurring. Just bring that up because anything that's clipped is going to be a solid black. And the problem with solid black is there's no detail. So if there's no detail, it just looks like a big amorphous blob. So we don't want that. I just want a very little things like the inside of the cat's nose there. It's just showing blue because I got the clipping indicator turned on. That's solid black. This little bit in here around the edge of the eye. And then we'll set our whites. And this is where we'll start to fix our snow from looking gray. So we're just going to bring that up a little bit. And then I'll bring up my highlights. Okay, good. A little bit more in the whites. That's starting to look better now. Okay.
Hey Josh, sorry to stop you. We have another question.
Sure.
If you would like to answer that. So it's by Chrissy. She's asking, is there a hack that is quick and easier for balancing white balance in your image? For example, balancing out the white and blacks with like just one click.
There is, and I'll show you what it is, but it doesn't always work. So if I reset this image, this is again the image as shot, raw. If you just go up to the very top, there's a button there called Auto. If you just click that, it will try and do it for you automatically. Okay, it'll set a white point, it'll set a black point, it'll set the exposure, highlights, shadows, everything for you automatically. It'll also do vibrance and saturation. So you can run with that, or you can then start to tweak the auto adjustment if you like. So if you need a starting point, if you're not sure where to start, auto can be a very good way to go because it gives you a starting point from which you can further tweak the dials. Because I do so much post-production, I always start from zero, from the base raw file and do it myself. But absolutely, you can just hit auto. There's nothing wrong with hitting auto. If you're working in black and white, I didn't show this, but you can also just hit the black and white. If you very quickly want to see the image in black and white, that's a good way to go as well. Excuse me. So those options are at the top, and that's also where that HDR button is located as well. So as you hit that, in fact, let me just demonstrate this because we've got a few minutes. And this is that new tool I was talking about of expanding the tonal range. And actually what it does show, which is very interesting, is how much latitude there is inside a raw file to retain detail in very, very bright highlights. So if we hit that, you see what happened to the histogram. I'll just turn it off again. It's in the top right-hand corner. You see how massively it expands. It's like we picked up 5 stops in the highlights. Now, unless you have an Apple XDR display or another display that is capable of displaying those highlights, you're not going to see it. That's why it's very, very difficult to demonstrate HDR, this new HDR tool online, or why I think it's pretty much a waste of time to put HDR images on the internet at this point in time, because most people out there who are viewing photographs are doing so from monitors that are barely 2K, and very, very few people are doing it from 4K monitors, and even fewer are doing it from 4K HDR monitors. So this is technology that I think is very, very interesting, but is probably 10 years away from being close to even close to being mainstream at this point in time. So I've chosen to ignore that new HDR feature. I have demonstrated it recently on some of my workshops in Greenland on an Apple MacBook using an XDR display. And as I said, I think it's quite interesting tech, but not that useful. I think we should just sum up at this point and just talk a little bit about why it's so important to color calibrate your display. And it's still something that I see a lot where people, not only people who are new to photography, but people who have been photographing for a long period of time, working on displays that are not calibrated. And whilst the image might look okay to your eye, most people have some sort of color blindness or have the inability to see cyan and magenta tints. And that's where having a color calibrated display will really, really help you. It's going to help you get accurate color, particularly if you're making prints as well. As in my case, I like to print a lot. So when I make a print and I'm printing this image of the Pallas cat, for example, or the polar bear, whatever it might be, it doesn't matter. That's the color I want to have. You know, that color in the cat's eyes here, that yellow is the yellow I want to get on my print. And that's the yellow that I want to see on all my calibrated displays. I don't want that to change shade or change tone or luminosity or anything like that. It should be constant. And in a well-calibrated pipeline, you can take an image from your computer to print, and it should look, the color should be identical. There should be no shift whatsoever. And that's not that hard to achieve if you work with a high-end monitor, such as one of these monitors from BenQ, and that you calibrate it. And all you really need to do that is something like a spectrophotometer or a colorimeter from a company like X-Rite or Spider, and there's many others on the market too, I think, nowadays. They're not very expensive, but it will help you a lot with color. Laptop screens are not a great way to go about calibrating, viewing your work. I know when we travel, that's all we usually have. But the problem with laptop screens is they have the luminosity varies a lot depending on the angle of the screen. So it can be very, very hard to judge brightness accurately. So that's why I do all my own post-production work back here in my studio. I don't do any serious post-production work when I'm out in the field, because I want to be doing it on a properly calibrated display that has a very flat, even luminance to it. And one of the interesting things people ask me, you know, what is it that you're paying for when you buy a photographic monitor? It's actually not just the color accuracy, it's also the luminosity accuracy. So how bright is the screen from corner to corner, and how even is that screen? Because the more even it is, the more it's going to look like paper, and the more comfortable it is to view, and the more easier it is to get screen to print matches as well. So working on a color calibrated display is really the cornerstone of what we do in digital photography. If you're not doing that, I would urge you to make a start with that. I think it's probably the best thing you can do is to work on a calibrated display. The nice thing about Lightroom, of course, is Lightroom doesn't give you any options for adjusting color space. So effectively, Lightroom is working what's called a ProPhoto color space. So it's a very large bucket of color, if you like, and you can't change it, which means that there's no room for error. So as long as you're working on a calibrated display, and you're working in Lightroom, you will have good accurate color, thanks to people like BenQ who make these monitors. So I think we can probably wrap it up there, unless there's any more questions. If
We
people,
have we have last three questions that we'll take. So one is, do you do any other adjustments when printing an image to avoid images printing too dark?
okay, that's a very common question, and it's a good question. Why are my prints too dark? And almost always, not always, but almost always, it's not that the print is too dark. It's usually that the monitor was too bright. So most monitors, when you buy them, or TVs for that matter, TVs, projectors, it doesn't matter what it is, any sort of display, when you take it out of the box, when you get it home, it's usually in what's called flamethrower mode. That means the brightness is cranked up to the maximum. Contrast is usually extremely high as well. And the reason that the manufacturers do that is so that their display, when it's sitting on the showroom floor next to all the others, looks brighter and better under very bright fluorescent light. But what you actually need to do is to calibrate it to get the brightness level down to something like 100 candelas. That's what I'm working on here in my studio. And once you have it calibrated properly, you'll find that your prints don't look too dark anymore, provided that you have a good profile. So the profile that you, not to get too deep into printing, but it's an important point. The profile is the difference table between the colors that you send to the printer and the printer actually prints. So if I send this image of the Pallas cat to the printer, there's a particular color that yellow is in the Pallas cat's eye. We're going to send that to the printer, and the printer is going to print something different. So the profile is the difference table that tells the printer what adjustment it needs to make to print the yellow that's on my screen. So the quality of the profile when you're making a print determines how accurate your final print is. And really, it's the key to all printing is a high quality profile. So if you are printing, I would urge you to either learn to make your own profiles, or have someone like myself who knows how to make profiles do it for you, so that you have getting great results. Yeah.
The next we have is by Chrissy. A lot of photographers like to get image right in camera first. Do you use a white balance 50% gray card for custom when shooting to get white in camera, or any white balance on the camera?
No, I always shoot in auto white balance. I don't use a gray card primarily because I'm not a commercial photographer. I'm a nature photographer, and I'm interested in pleasing color more than accurate color. So it doesn't matter to me if that eye color in the Pallas cat is completely accurate. What matters to me is it pleasing to my eye? That's far more important. So I would use a gray card, for example, if I was asked by a company to photograph their new car, and that new car was a particular color purple, and they wanted to make very sure that they were getting that color purple in their final digital files. I would use a gray card, and I would photograph that gray card in front of the car under a given light source, and then I could use that gray card to set the accurate white point that would give me just that right color purple. So that's, if I was a commercial photographer, I think there's a very strong argument for gray cards. But I think in nature photography, pleasing white balance is far more important than accurate white balance. The other thing just to say on that actually is sometimes accurate white balance will remove all the feeling from the photograph. What do I mean by that? I mean that let's take this image of the Pallas cat and look at white balance. If we neutralize this image and we set an accurate white balance, it's going to remove all that feeling of cold from the snow, because it's going to make it white, not blue. At the moment, it's blue, which gives us a feeling of cold. So I want that, because I want to evoke feelings in my viewers. I want them to feel something when they look at the photographs. So I don't necessarily want to have a perfectly neutral white snow. Sometimes I do, but not always. Quite often I want to give the feeling of cold, so therefore I want that snow to be a little bit blue.
The next question is, if you're on a budget, what BenQ monitor would you suggest?
Okay, I'm not familiar with the entire range. I'm working on the SW272U. That's their new 4K version. There is also a 2K version, which is quite a lot less expensive. I think putting the fact that I'm a BenQ ambassador aside for the moment, the bang for buck you get out of a BenQ display is phenomenal. it was only a couple of years ago that you couldn't get this level of color accuracy, this level of luminosity performance in monitors anywhere near this price point. You would have to spend $6, $7, $8, $9, even $10,000 or more to get this level of quality in a monitor. But nowadays we can get it in monitors that are much, much more affordable. And that's the wonderful thing about trickle down technology, is eventually that high end stuff finds its way into consumer products and more affordable products. So have a look on BenQ's website. Only you know whether you need a 2K or a 4K monitor, but all of the photographic monitors from BenQ work in what's called the Adobe RGB color space. Again, it's a very large color space. All of the monitors are above 98% of that Adobe RGB space, so all of them will do the job. This monitor I'm working on here is an Adobe RGB monitor, and you have to keep in mind that that's a very big color space compared to the color space of the internet, which is sRGB, a much smaller color space. So that's the other benefit, of course, to going to a photographic monitor, is you get to see more color. And that makes a huge difference, because if I'm looking at a football field, if I'm a sports photographer and I've just come back from photographing the football game, all those beautiful shades of green that I see on my photographic monitor, I don't see on the laptop, because the laptop screen is just not capable of displaying those colors. So you get one continuous tone of green rather than all those beautiful shades of green. So the working on a large color space monitor is extremely important. So jump on BenQ's website and just have a look what their models are, because also size plays a big factor as well. Whether you need a 27-inch, whether you need something smaller, or whether you need something really big. A lot depends on how close you sit to the screen, how blind you might be with or without glasses, and your comfort level for viewing distance too.
Awesome. So I think that's all for tonight. Thank you so much for for joining us, Josh. And thank you all to all the participants that joined us tonight. The recording of this webinar would be available later on YouTube, and I'll send most of you a link through email. Please wait for a short survey as this webinar ends. Thank you so much from Team BenQ again.
Thank you, everyone. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can just reach out to me through my website, drop me an email. I'm more than happy to take the time and respond. It's www.jholko.com. Thank you to BenQ. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.